When I stepped through those courtroom doors, my ex-husband, Daniel Morrison, laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A loud, careless one that echoed through the courtroom like he had already won. His girlfriend, Rachel, leaned toward him and said something just loud enough for the people around them to hear. She's absolutely nothing. 3 simple words. But those 3 words were meant to erase 18 years of my life. 18 years of marriage. 18 years of building a company from a tiny rented workshop into Morrison Industrial Solutions, one of Cleveland's most respected manufacturing firms. 18 years of raising 2 children who meant more to me than my own breath. And in that moment, to them, I was nothing. I heard Rachel laugh again, that sharp, artificial laugh she had perfected over the past year. Not the warm one from our wedding video. Not the one she used to have when we stayed up late assembling Lily's birthday toys. No, this one was different. Cold, calculated, designed to humiliate. She sat beside Daniel like she belonged there, like she had always been part of our life, like I had been the outsider all along. Rachel whispered something into Daniel's ear, and he smirked. Behind them, Daniel's sister Beth rolled her eyes in my direction. They looked relaxed, confident, victorious. They had prepared everything. False witness statements, carefully edited videos, photographs designed to make me look unstable. They had even moved $45,000 of our marital money into a fake business Daniel's girlfriend helped him create. Their plan was simple: destroy my reputation, take my children, take my company, and walk away with everything. But then something happened, something none of them expected. The courtroom door behind the judge opened. Judge Catherine Mills walked in, adjusting the stack of documents in her hands. She looked tired, distracted, like it was just another divorce case in a long day of hearings. She sat down, picked up the file, and then she looked up. Her eyes landed on me. For a moment, she didn't move. The color drained from her face so quickly, it looked like someone had pulled the blood out of her skin. Her hand froze halfway to the gavel. The entire courtroom went quiet. Daniel stopped smiling. Rachel frowned in confusion. Even the court reporter paused mid-keystroke. Judge Mills stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then she whispered something that silenced the entire room. "Is that actually her?" Rachel turned slowly toward Daniel. His expression had changed completely. That was the exact moment they realized something was terribly wrong. "My name is Laura Morrison. I'm 43 years old, and the people who tried to destroy my life had just made the worst mistake they would ever make. Because when they tried to turn me into nothing, they had no idea who they were really dealing with." I was 33 when I met Daniel Morrison. At the time, I was not looking for love. I was looking for survival. I had spent most of my 20s fighting for every inch of my life. I worked long hours, took risks other people called reckless, and built my career with the kind of discipline that leaves very little room for softness. By the time I met him, I was already laying the foundation for what would later become Morrison Industrial Solutions. Back then, it wasn't a company people respected. It was just me, a small office, 2 folding chairs, 1 unreliable printer, and a stubborn belief that I could build something real with my own hands. Daniel walked into my life at a charity event for local businesses in Cleveland. He was handsome in a polished, easy way, the kind of man who knew exactly how to make eye contact without seeming aggressive, the kind of man who smiled as if he had already decided he liked you and was just waiting for you to catch up. "You look like you hate small talk," he said when he introduced himself. I laughed despite myself. "I do." "Good," he said. "Then maybe we can skip it." That was Daniel in the beginning. Charming, observant, warm without being overwhelming. He made me feel seen in a season of my life when most people only saw what I could produce. He asked about my work and actually listened to the answer. He remembered details. He brought me coffee one morning before an early meeting and got the order exactly right. He sent flowers to the office the day I closed my first major contract, not with some dramatic note, but with a simple card that said, "You earned this." For a woman like me, those things mattered, not because I was easy to impress, but because I had spent years being strong, and Daniel seemed like the first person who made strength feel safe instead of lonely. We dated for almost 2 years before we got married. Those years, when I look back on them now, feel softened by memory in a way that almost makes me angry, because I know how they ended. I know what he eventually became. And still, part of me can remember the man who used to reach for my hand under the table during dinner with friends. The man who kissed my forehead when I fell asleep over spreadsheets. The man who stood in our kitchen one winter evening, flour on his shirt from helping Lily make cookies years later, and looked so much like home that I mistook comfort for permanence. That is the cruelty of betrayal. It does not arrive wearing a stranger's face. It arrives looking like someone you once trusted with your entire future. When we married, I believed we were building a partnership. I was the more driven one professionally. Daniel was steady, social, and good with people. He liked being part of the image of our life, the house, the children, the dinners, the routines. I handled the pressure of the business. He handled the softer edges of the home, at least in the beginning. When Owen was born, he cried before I did. When Lily came along 4 years later, he held her so carefully it brought tears to my eyes. For a long time, we looked like the kind of family people envy quietly. A good home, healthy children, a successful company, a marriage that had lasted long enough to seem unbreakable. But if I am honest, the cracks did not start in the final year. They had been there much earlier. I just kept painting over them because I was busy, because I was tired, because love makes excuses long before it makes conclusions. Daniel had always needed admiration more than I understood at first. At parties, he wanted to be the center of every circle. If people complimented my work too much, I would notice his silence afterward in the car. If I missed a dinner because of an emergency at the plant, he would say he understood, but his mouth would tighten in that subtle way I learned to recognize and ignore. "It's just one night," I would tell him. "It's never just one night, Laura," he said once, staring out the kitchen window. "Everything in this house revolves around your company." I remember drying a plate with a dish towel, feeling the sting of guilt before I even replied. This house exists because of that company. He had looked at me then with a smile that didn't feel like one. "I know," he said. "That's exactly my point." At the time, I told myself that marriage had seasons, that resentment was natural, that long-term love required tolerance, patience, flexibility. I thought if I just worked a little harder at home, listened a little more carefully, softened my tone, made more time, then whatever distance had started growing between us would shrink again. Instead, it widened. Daniel became more involved in neighborhood events, community committees, those local safety meetings he suddenly seemed passionate about. That was where Rachel entered the picture. At first, she was just a name. Rachel from the Neighborhood Watch says the council might change parking rules. Rachel's organizing the fundraiser. Rachel knows someone who can help with the school security issue. Just a name. Then a presence. Then a frequency. She started appearing in stories too often for it to feel accidental. When there was a school function, she seemed to be there. When there was a community event, Daniel mentioned that she had helped organize it. Once, when I came home late from work, I found a paper flyer on the counter with Rachel's handwriting on it. I remember holding that flyer and feeling something shift inside me, so quietly I almost missed it. Not certainty. Not proof. Just discomfort. A woman's intuition is rarely loud at first. It begins as a whisper. And if you love someone enough, you become very good at talking over it. Daniel's family did not help. His sister Beth had always been polite to my face and cutting behind my back. She thought I was too ambitious, too independent, too unemotional. The kind of woman who made other people uncomfortable because she didn't apologize for being competent. "Men need to feel needed," she told me once over Thanksgiving dinner, swirling wine in her glass like she was offering wisdom instead of criticism. I smiled tightly. I didn't realize marriage was a performance review. Beth laughed, but her eyes stayed cold. Daniel's mother was subtler. She never openly insulted me. She just praised women who were softer, more domestic, more available. Women who, conveniently, looked nothing like me. and Daniel let it happen. That was one of the signs I should have taken more seriously. Not the big betrayals, the small permissions, the moments he failed to defend me, the moments he let me stand alone while people chipped pieces off me in plain sight. By the final year of our marriage, our conversations had changed. They were no longer about dreams, plans, and family. They were about schedules, logistics. Who was picking up Lily, whether Owen had soccer practice, whether I would be late again. I told myself this was what mature marriage looked like when life got busy. I didn't want to admit that something tender between us had gone missing. Then Daniel stopped asking about my day. It sounds small, but it wasn't. For years, no matter how tired we both were, he asked, "How did the meeting go? Did the deal close? You look exhausted. Rough day?" Then suddenly, he stopped. And when someone who used to care becomes indifferent, the silence is louder than any argument. I noticed other things too. He guarded his phone differently. He started dressing with more care for ordinary errands. He became oddly cheerful on nights when we barely spoke. And all the while, I was still trying to keep our family steady. Still packing school lunches. Still reviewing contracts after midnight. Still believing that if I loved hard enough, I could hold together what was quietly falling apart. I did not know then that Daniel was already building another life. Not just an affair, a strategy. A lie so carefully constructed that by the time I saw the full shape of it, he was already prepared to use our children, our money, and my own reputation against me. Looking back now, I can see the path clearly. But at the time, I was just a woman trying to save a marriage that had already begun plotting against her. And the worst part, I still loved him while it was happening. That is what made the next part hurt so much. Because by the time the first real crack split open, I was still standing there, trying to call it stress. If I had to pinpoint the moment when doubt first stopped being a whisper and started becoming something heavier, it wasn't a dramatic discovery. There was no lipstick on a collar. No suspicious hotel receipt. It was something much quieter. Daniel stopped looking at me the way he used to. For years, even during difficult periods, there had always been a certain warmth in his eyes when he saw me. Not dramatic romance, just familiarity. The kind that comes from building a life together, piece by piece. Then one day, that look disappeared. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. We had 2 children, a growing company, a mortgage, aging parents, and the kind of schedules that could exhaust anyone. Distance in marriage happens. Every book about relationships says so. But distance is one thing. Indifference is something else entirely. The changes were small enough that I almost ignored them. Daniel started attending neighborhood watch meetings every week. That alone wasn't unusual. Our area had seen a few car break-ins, and several families were organizing community patrols. Still, it was strange how committed he suddenly became. Every Thursday evening, every single week. Sometimes he stayed out late. Community planning takes time, he told me when I asked once. I nodded and returned to my laptop, pretending his explanation felt normal. But then other things began shifting too. Daniel stopped asking about my work completely. Not just less often, never. For a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades building a company while raising children, that silence felt like a door closing somewhere inside the house. One night, I tried to reopen it. I had just finished a difficult negotiation with a supplier that could potentially save the company several $100,000 a year. I came home feeling exhausted but proud. Daniel was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone. "I think I just secured the largest materials contract we've ever had," I said, dropping my bag near the door. He looked up briefly. "That's good," he said. Then his eyes returned to the screen. That was it. 3 seconds. After years of being my sounding board, I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for a follow-up question that never came. "How was your meeting tonight?" I asked finally. "Fine," he said. "Just fine." That word became his favorite answer. Fine, fine, fine. Eventually, I stopped asking. The distance between us grew quietly, like fog filling a room. Meanwhile, our children were beginning to notice. Owen was 13 by then, old enough to observe tension, even if he didn't fully understand it. One evening after dinner, he lingered in the kitchen while Lily went upstairs. "Mom?" he asked cautiously. Yes? Are you and Dad okay? I dried my hands on a dish towel, forcing a smile. Why would you ask that? He shrugged. You just don't talk the same anymore. Children see more than we think. I knelt down slightly so we were eye level. Every marriage has busy seasons, I told him gently. Dad and I are just dealing with a lot right now. He studied my face with the serious expression he had inherited from me. Okay, he said eventually. But he didn't sound convinced. Around that same time, Daniel's sister Beth began appearing more often. Beth had always had a complicated relationship with me. Polite in public, critical in private. One afternoon, she came by while Daniel was at work. She sat at our kitchen table, sipping coffee and watching me answer emails on my laptop. You know, she said casually, Daniel used to be so much happier. I paused mid-sentence. Happier when? Before everything revolved around your company. Her tone was light, but the words carried weight. My company pays for this house, I said calmly. I know, she replied quickly, but men need attention too, Laura. I closed the laptop slowly. Are you saying I don't give Daniel enough attention? Beth smiled in that thin, careful way she had perfected. I'm just saying, people get lonely. Lonely. The word hung in the air long after she left. That night, when Daniel returned from another neighborhood meeting, I asked him directly, Are you unhappy? He looked genuinely surprised. Where is this coming from? Beth was here earlier. Daniel sighed heavily. Beth loves drama. So you're happy? I pressed. He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. I'm fine, he said. That word again. Fine. Something inside me tightened, but I let the conversation die. Because sometimes the truth sits right in front of you, and you choose not to pick it up. Weeks passed. Daniel spent more and more evenings away. Neighborhood meetings, community planning, late dinners with friends. Once or twice, I noticed unfamiliar numbers appearing on our phone bill. Calls lasting 20 or 30 minutes late at night. When I asked about them, he brushed it off. Neighborhood coordination. Another time, I found a receipt from a restaurant across town, a place we had never been together. When I asked him about that, he laughed. Beth and I grabbed lunch. Later, I would discover Beth had been out of state that day. But at the time, I accepted the explanation, because accepting it was easier than asking harder questions. Still, the uneasiness kept growing. Daniel started dressing differently, more polished, more careful. He even changed his cologne after wearing the same brand for nearly 10 years. New scent? I asked one morning. Just trying something different, he said. Then there was Rachel. At first, she was just someone Daniel mentioned occasionally. Rachel organized the patrol routes. Rachel found a security company that might help the neighborhood. Rachel thinks the city council might approve extra street lighting. Eventually, I met her at a school fundraiser. She was attractive in a confident, social way. Friendly, polished. The kind of woman who made conversation feel effortless. Daniel introduced us. Laura, this is Rachel. She smiled warmly. I've heard so much about you, she said. There was something in her tone I couldn't quite define. Admiration, maybe? Or curiosity? Or something else entirely. Daniel stood beside her during the entire event, laughing, talking, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. When we drove home later that night, I asked casually, You and Rachel seem close. Daniel shrugged. She's just active in the neighborhood. Just. Yes, Laura, just. His irritation surprised me. I dropped the subject. But the feeling stayed. And over the next few months, that quiet discomfort slowly began turning into something heavier. Something that felt less like suspicion and more like the beginning of a storm I couldn't yet see clearly. I didn't know it then. But Daniel and Rachel were already planning something far worse than an affair. They weren't just building a relationship. They were building a case against me. And by the time the first real piece of evidence surfaced, the trap they had been setting was already nearly complete. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. I remember the day with uncomfortable clarity, the way people remember accidents in slow motion. Tuesdays were always my longest days at the manufacturing plant. By the time I got home that evening, the sky over Cleveland had already turned dark, and the September air carried that faint chill that warns summer is ending. I was tired in the ordinary way, physically drained, but mentally still moving through numbers, production schedules, supplier negotiations. The envelope was wedged into the screen door. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then I saw the legal seal. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. I carried it inside, set my briefcase on the floor, and sat down at the kitchen table we had bought at an estate sale 14 years earlier. The wood surface still had the same faint scratch from when Owen accidentally dragged a toy truck across it when he was 5. For a long moment, I just stared at the envelope. Then I opened it. 26 pages. Morrison versus Morrison. That single word, versus, did something permanent to my chest. For nearly 2 decades, we had been partners. Now, we were legal opponents. I flipped through the pages slowly, each sentence colder than the last. Daniel Morrison was filing for divorce. He was requesting primary custody of both children. He was claiming that my work schedule made me an unstable parent. He was asking the court to grant him control of several marital assets, including partial influence over the company I had built from nothing. The room felt strangely quiet. I kept expecting Daniel to walk in and explain that it was some kind of mistake, but the house was empty. Too empty. I stood up slowly and walked down the hallway toward our bedroom. That was when the second realization hit. The closet door was open. Half the hangers were empty. I hadn't noticed before. Daniel's clothes were gone. His dresser drawers were cleared out. Even the bathroom counter looked different. Cleaner. Emptier. His razor. His cologne. His watch stand. Gone. I walked back into the bedroom slowly, trying to understand how an entire person had disappeared from my life without me realizing it. Then I saw the picture frame. Our honeymoon photo from the Smoky Mountains. It was turned face down on the dresser. That hurt more than the papers, because it meant he had stood there, looked at that photograph, and deliberately flipped it over. 2 weeks later, I moved out. Not because I wanted to, but because Daniel's lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming the house environment was too tense for the children. My attorney advised me not to fight that particular battle yet. It will look better later if you appear cooperative, she said. So I rented a small duplex on the west side of Cleveland. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen with appliances older than our marriage. The sink faucet dripped constantly. I meant to fix it several times, but I never got around to it. At night, lying on the couch, I would listen to the steady drip of water and wonder if this was what the rest of my life would sound like. Quiet. Lonely. Slow erosion. The children came that first weekend. Owen walked through the duplex like he was investigating a crime scene, hands deep in his pockets, eyes scanning everything. Lily looked around the small living room and asked the question I had been dreading. "Where is my bedroom?" I forced a smile. "You'll take the bedroom. I'll sleep on the couch." She frowned. "But where will you sleep when we're not here?" "Still the couch," I said lightly. Her eyes filled with tears anyway. Owen stood by the window, watching cars pass outside. "Mom said you wanted space from us," he said quietly. That sentence landed like a knife. I chose my words carefully. That's not exactly what happened. Divorce turns every sentence into potential evidence. Every conversation with your children can later appear in court transcripts. "She said you two just grew apart," Owen continued. He finally turned toward me. At 13, he already had that expression children develop when they know adults are hiding something. The truth was right there in my throat. That Daniel had been seeing Rachel for months before filing. That I had found suspicious credit card charges and deleted messages. That he had already started preparing a narrative where I was the problem. But you don't burden your children with adult betrayals. Not if you can help it. "Sometimes things become complicated," I said softly. "But you and Lily are my priority. Always." Owen nodded, but his eyes told me he wasn't fully convinced. That moment hurt worse than the divorce papers. My son doubted me. That night, after the children fell asleep, I sat at the small kitchen table with a notebook I had bought from a grocery store earlier that day. Black cover. Elastic band. I opened it, and I started writing. Every detail, every conversation, every missed pickup time, every last-minute cancellation Daniel made for my visitation weekends, every excuse, every message, dates, times, witnesses, At the time, it felt like paranoia, like I was slowly losing my mind. But something deep inside me had begun to shift. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. Because for the first time since the divorce papers arrived, I began to suspect that Daniel wasn't just leaving the marriage. He was building a case against me. And if I didn't start protecting myself, he might succeed. What I didn't know yet was how far he and Rachel were willing to go, or how dangerous their plan actually was. The real explosion would come 3 months later, from someone neither of them expected. And that moment would change everything. The first few weeks after the divorce papers arrived felt like living inside fog, not the kind that rolls over a lake in the morning and disappears when the sun rises. This fog stayed. It sat in my chest, in my thoughts, in every quiet moment when I wasn't busy enough to distract myself. During the day, I functioned. I went to the plant. I attended meetings. I signed contracts. I spoke to suppliers. No one there knew my life was collapsing. To them, I was still Laura Morrison, the woman who ran operations with sharp focus and calm authority. But the moment I stepped back into that small duplex at night, everything felt different. The silence was louder. The dripping faucet in the kitchen became a kind of background soundtrack to my thoughts. Drip, drip, drip. Sometimes I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the last year of my marriage over and over again, trying to locate the moment when things had truly changed. Was it when Daniel stopped asking about my day? Was it when Rachel started appearing in every conversation? Or had the shift happened much earlier, and I simply didn't want to see it? One evening, about 3 weeks after moving out, I finally forced myself to call him. Not about the divorce, about the children. Daniel answered on the 4th ring. Hello? His voice sounded calm, casual, as if nothing significant had happened. I wanted to talk about Owen's soccer schedule, I said. Oh, he replied flatly. Rachel already coordinated that with the coach. I froze. Rachel? Yes, he said impatiently. She's helping with the kids' activities now. Something sharp twisted inside my chest. She's not their parent. She's helping, he repeated. The casual way he said it made my hands tighten around the phone. Daniel, I said slowly, you don't get to replace me in my children's lives with your girlfriend. She's not replacing you. Then why is she organizing their schedules? He sighed loudly, like I was the one being unreasonable. You're busy, Laura. You've always been busy. The words landed harder than he probably intended. I've always worked, I said quietly. That's how this family was supported. You chose work, he replied. Now the kids need stability. Stability. The word felt like a weapon. You're filing for full custody, I said. You're telling the court I'm unstable. I'm telling the truth, he said. The calm certainty in his voice made something inside me go cold. Daniel, I said carefully, what exactly are you telling them? That you're distant, that you're rarely home, that the kids feel more secure with me. My chest tightened. That's not true. Then the court will decide. There was a brief pause. And then I heard Rachel's voice in the background. Daniel, are you still on the phone? The familiarity in her tone made my stomach turn. He didn't even lower his voice. Just finishing up, I could hear her laugh faintly. That same sharp laugh I would later hear in the courtroom. You're already living together? I asked quietly. Rachel spends time here, he said, in our house, in the rooms where our children slept, in the kitchen where I had cooked thousands of dinners. A wave of anger rose so quickly I had to grip the counter to steady myself. You moved her into our home 3 weeks after filing for divorce? Laura, he said, his tone turning cold. You moved out. Because your lawyer forced the issue. That's not how the court will see it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The realization hit me slowly. This wasn't just a breakup. It was strategy. Every step had been calculated. You've been planning this, I said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. You're trying to make me look like the absent parent. You made those choices yourself, he replied. No, I said, my voice steady now. You're rewriting history. You can call it whatever you want. Then he said something that stayed with me for months afterward. Rachel understands the kids better than you ever did. The words hit harder than any insult he could have chosen, not because they were true, but because he believed them, or at least wanted to believe them. Good night, Daniel, I said calmly, and I hung up. For several minutes, I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the wall. My reflection in the dark window looked older than I remembered, more tired. But something else had appeared in my eyes. Resolve. Because that phone call had finally clarified something important. Daniel wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He wasn't even particularly emotional. He was confident. Confident that his story would win. Confident that Rachel's support and his lawyer's narrative would convince the court. Confident that I was too distracted, too hurt, too overwhelmed to fight effectively. That night, I opened the black notebook again, and I began documenting everything more carefully. Every canceled visitation, every schedule change, every time Rachel inserted herself into decisions about my children, every conversation with Daniel, dates, times, details. At first, it felt obsessive, but slowly it began to feel like protection. 2 weeks later, Daniel canceled my scheduled weekend with the kids. "Lily has a birthday party," he texted. I wrote it down. 3 days after that, he canceled again. "Owen has a school project." I wrote that down too. Then something strange happened. One evening, when I drove by the house to return a soccer bag Owen had forgotten, I saw a pickup truck parked in the driveway. I recognized it immediately. Rachel's. It was 7:30 p.m., the night I was supposed to have the kids. I parked down the street for a moment, just watching. And for the first time since the divorce began, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not confusion, determination, because suddenly it was obvious. Daniel and Rachel weren't just building a new relationship. They were building a narrative, one where I was the distant mother, the unstable businesswoman, the parent who didn't show up. And if I didn't fight back carefully, that story might become the official version of my life. So I kept writing every detail, every inconsistency, every lie. At the time, I didn't know whether it would matter, but a small part of me had started to believe something important. The truth, if you document it long enough, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. And 3 months later, someone would walk into my life carrying proof that Daniel and Rachel had underestimated me completely. Her name was Sophia Martinez, and the moment she spoke to me, everything began to change. By the 3rd month of the separation, my life had developed a strange kind of rhythm. Daytime belonged to work. Nighttime belonged to paperwork, legal strategy, and the quiet ache of missing my children. And in between those two worlds, there was the notebook. The black notebook had become almost a second memory for me. Every time Daniel canceled a visitation, every time Rachel inserted herself into the children's lives, every time something felt slightly off, I wrote it down. At first, it had felt obsessive. Now it felt necessary. Patterns began to appear. Daniel would cancel my scheduled weekends with the children at the last possible moment, always with some excuse that sounded reasonable on the surface. "Lily has a birthday party." "Owen has a group project." "The kids are tired and need to stay home." But something about the timing bothered me. The cancellations were never random. They always happened when Rachel was home. One Saturday afternoon, after another canceled visit, I drove past the house. I told myself I was just checking whether the kids were okay. But the moment I turned onto our old street, I knew exactly what I was doing. Rachel's pickup truck was in the driveway. The same night, Daniel had told me the children were too busy to see me. I parked half a block away and took a photo. The timestamp was clear. The date matched the canceled visitation. That picture became the first piece of something much larger. From that point on, every time a visit was canceled, I quietly checked the house. Rachel's truck was there almost every time, sometimes overnight, sometimes all weekend. I photographed everything: license plates, dates, times. I felt ridiculous at first, like a detective investigating my own life, but slowly the truth began forming into something solid. Daniel wasn't just moving on. He was systematically limiting my time with the children while presenting himself to the court as the stable, present parent. Rachel was helping him build that image. Meanwhile, Daniel's sister Beth began increasing the pressure. She started showing up at Owen's soccer games and Lily's school events, always with Rachel, always sitting beside Daniel like they were already a complete family. One afternoon at a soccer match, I arrived early and took a seat near the field. Owen waved when he saw me. A few minutes later, Daniel walked into the stands with Rachel and Beth. Rachel smiled politely when she noticed me. Beth didn't bother hiding her expression. "Well," she said loudly enough for me to hear, "look who finally had time to show up." I ignored her. Owen ran toward me during halftime. "Mom, did you see my pass in the first half?" "I did," I said, smiling. "It was perfect." Daniel walked over then. Rachel stayed a few steps behind him. "We should talk about Owen's schedule," Daniel said. "I've been trying to," I replied. Rachel suddenly spoke. "Owen has extra practice next weekend." I turned slowly toward her. "I wasn't aware you were part of this conversation." Her smile tightened. "I'm just helping coordinate things. You're not their parent." Daniel sighed. "Laura, don't start." "Start what?" I asked calmly. "Asking why your girlfriend is making decisions about my children?" The tension between us thickened. Owen stood awkwardly between us, looking at the ground. Rachel crossed her arms. "We're just trying to provide stability," she said. The word again. Stability. They had clearly practiced this narrative. Daniel looked at Owen. "Go warm up, buddy." Owen ran back toward the field without another word. When he was gone, Daniel's tone hardened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said quietly. "You are." Rachel stepped closer to him, and in that moment, I realized something chilling. They were completely confident, not just about their relationship, about the court case, about the outcome. They believed they had already won. That realization followed me home that evening. I sat at the small kitchen table in the duplex, staring at the notebook. Drip, drip, drip. The faucet continued its slow rhythm. I flipped through the pages I had already written. Dates. Times. Canceled visits. Rachel's truck. Beth's comments. Daniel's messages. It was a lot of information, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Then, one Sunday evening, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hello?" There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Morrison?" "Yes." "My name is Sophia Martinez." Her voice sounded nervous. "I used to work for your family." I sat up straighter immediately. "Sophia?" Sophia had been our nanny for 2 years. She had helped with school pickups, homework, dinner preparation. The children loved her. "What happened?" I asked. "I need to talk to you about something important." Her voice trembled slightly. "Something about Daniel and Rachel." My pulse quickened. "Are the children okay?" "They're okay," she said quickly. "But there are things happening in that house you need to know about." We agreed to meet that evening at a small coffee shop on Euclid Avenue. When I arrived, Sophia was already sitting at a corner table. She looked exhausted, nervous, but determined. She didn't waste time. "I was fired 4 days ago," she said. "Why?" "Because Mrs. Morrison asked me to lie." The words landed heavily between us. "Lie about what?" Sophia reached into her bag and placed a small digital recorder on the table. I started recording conversations. I stared at the device. "What kind of conversations?" Her voice dropped. "Daniel and Rachel planning the court case." My heart began beating faster. "They talk about you like you're not even a person," she continued. "They're trying to prove you're mentally unstable, that you drink around the children, that you neglect them." "That's not true," I said quietly. "I know." She pushed the recorder closer to me. "There are 6 recordings." I hesitated before touching it. "What's on them?" Sophia's hands trembled slightly. "They talk about moving money, about setting you up to look irresponsible." My stomach turned cold. "Money?" "Yes." She swallowed. "And Rachel asked me to sign a written statement saying you drank alcohol around the kids." "What?" "I refused," she said. "So she fired me." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophia said something that changed everything. "There's more." I looked at her. "Marcus has a temper." "Marcus?" "Rachel's boyfriend." The name felt strange in my ears. "What do you mean?" "I saw him grab Owen's arm once," she said quietly. "Hard enough to leave bruises." My entire body went rigid. "When?" 3 weeks ago." She pulled out her phone. "I took a picture." She turned the screen toward me. Clear finger-shaped bruises covered Owen's upper arm. My vision blurred. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then Sophia said softly, "I thought you deserved to know the truth." That night, after copying every file and every photo she had brought, I made one phone call to my lawyer. "Patricia," I said, "we need to meet tonight." Because in that moment, I finally understood something. Daniel and Rachel thought they had built the perfect story, but they had just made one fatal mistake. They assumed the truth would stay hidden. And now, it was about to explode. That night, after meeting Sophia, I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car in the coffee shop parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the small digital recorder resting in my hand. The city lights of Cleveland blurred slightly through the windshield. Cars passed. People walked along the sidewalk. Life moved around me like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Because now the vague suspicion I had been carrying for months had turned into something solid. Daniel and Rachel weren't just lying. They were planning. Planning to destroy me, planning to take my children. And somehow, knowing that truth didn't make me feel stronger. It made me feel exhausted. For the first time since the divorce began, the weight of everything hit me at once. The betrayal, the manipulation, the possibility that my children were living in a house where a man had already hurt my son. I gripped the steering wheel and closed my eyes. For a moment, I wasn't the calm business owner or the strategic parent documenting every detail. I was just a woman whose entire life had been pulled out from under her. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Owen, at 6 years old, running toward me in the backyard with a scraped knee. "Mom, it hurts." I had lifted him, cleaned the wound, kissed the top of his head. "You're okay," I told him then. But now I wondered whether he had stood in that same kitchen weeks ago, hiding bruises on his arm because he thought telling me would make things worse. That thought broke something inside me. I lowered my head against the steering wheel and let myself cry. Not the controlled tears I had allowed in private before, real ones. The kind that shake your chest and leave your throat raw. Because no matter how strong you are, there comes a moment when the reality of betrayal is too heavy to carry quietly. And that night was mine. Eventually the tears stopped, not because I had suddenly become stronger again, but because exhaustion replaced them. I wiped my face, started the car, and drove across the city to Patricia Harmon's house. Patricia had been practicing family law longer than I had been alive. She lived in an old brick home in Shaker Heights, the kind of house that seemed to carry decades of quiet authority in its walls. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask questions immediately. She just stepped aside. "Come in," she said softly. "I'll make coffee." We sat at her dining room table. I placed the recorder on the wood surface between us. Then I showed her everything. The recordings, the photograph of Owen's bruised arm, my notebook filled with 3 months of documentation. Patricia listened to the recordings twice, then a third time. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly. She just wrote notes in that precise handwriting that seemed to belong to every experienced attorney. When the final recording ended, the room fell silent. I expected anger, shock, something dramatic. Instead, Patricia simply leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "This changes everything," she said quietly. My voice felt hoarse. "Is it enough?" She looked at me carefully. "It's more than enough." I felt a fragile wave of relief begin to rise. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten again. "But we have to be careful." "Careful how?" "They think they're winning," she said. "And that's an advantage for us." She tapped the recorder lightly. "If we reveal this too early, they'll start cleaning up their story." "What do you suggest?" Patricia stood and walked toward a bookshelf, pulling down a thick legal binder. "We document everything quietly," she said. "We build the case piece by piece." Her eyes met mine again. "And we let them walk into court believing their lies are working." I stared at the notebook in front of me. "All this time I thought I was losing," I admitted. Patricia shook her head slowly. "No." She tapped the recorder again. "They're losing. They just don't know it yet." Despite her confidence, the next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. because now I knew the truth. And yet I still had to act as if I didn't. Daniel continued canceling visits. Rachel continued appearing at school events. Beth continued making quiet comments about my supposed instability. And every time it happened, I had to remain calm. Document. Observe. Wait. One evening, after another canceled weekend, Owen surprised me. I had just dropped him back at the house after soccer practice. He stood outside my car for a moment longer than usual. Then he leaned down toward the window. Mom? Yes? He hesitated. Marcus isn't a good guy. My chest tightened. What makes you say that? Owen looked toward the house. The lights inside were on. Rachel's car was in the driveway. Just trust me, he said quietly. Then he stepped back and closed the car door. I sat there watching him walk toward the house, feeling something heavy settle in my chest, because that was the moment I realized something painful. My children were already living inside the consequences of Daniel's choices, and until the truth came out, they were trapped there. That realization nearly broke me. But it also made one thing perfectly clear. This fight was no longer about the divorce. It wasn't even about Daniel's betrayal. It was about protecting my children. And if that meant walking through months of uncertainty, if it meant standing quietly while people questioned my character, then I would endure it. Because eventually the truth would come out. And when it did, everything Daniel and Rachel had built on lies would collapse. The turning point didn't happen with shouting. It didn't happen with anger. It happened quietly, in a courtroom where Daniel and Rachel thought they were about to win. 3 months after my meeting with Sophia, Patricia Harmon filed a sealed motion with the court. Every piece of evidence was included. The recordings, the bank transfers, the documentation of canceled visitations, the photograph of Owen's bruised arm. The sealed file was delivered directly to Judge Catherine Mills 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing. Daniel's legal team didn't know it existed. Rachel didn't know it existed. Marcus certainly didn't know it existed. And that was exactly the point. Let them walk into court confident, Patricia told me during our final preparation meeting. They've underestimated you this entire time. That's their biggest weakness. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of Cleveland morning where the sky hangs low over the city like unfinished thoughts. I stood outside the courthouse for a moment before walking in, adjusting the blue scrunchie around my wrist that belonged to Lily. It had become a small ritual, something to remind myself why I was fighting. Inside, the courtroom was already filling. Daniel sat near the back with Rachel beside him. Marcus was there too. And Beth. They looked relaxed. Rachel leaned close to Daniel, whispering something that made him laugh. Marcus sat back in his chair like he owned the room. The moment I stepped through the door, that was when Daniel laughed. Rachel's voice carried clearly across the courtroom. She's absolutely nothing. The words were meant for me, but they were loud enough for half the room to hear. Marcus leaned toward Daniel and said something under his breath that made the three of them laugh again. I didn't react. Patricia had warned me. Let them show their confidence, she said. It will make the fall harder. So I walked to our table and sat down quietly. Patricia gave me a small nod. Then the courtroom doors behind the judge opened. Judge Catherine Mills entered. She looked tired at first, distracted. Just another judge starting another routine hearing. She organized the papers on her bench and reached for the file. Then she looked up. Her eyes landed on me. And everything stopped. The color drained from her face. Her hand froze halfway to the gavel. For 3 full seconds, she simply stared. Then she looked down at the sealed file in front of her, touched it once, and whispered something that echoed through the silent courtroom. Is that actually her? A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Rachel stopped smiling. Daniel's posture stiffened slightly. Marcus frowned. Patricia leaned toward me. That, she whispered, is exactly what we wanted. The hearing began. Daniel's lawyer, Kenneth Barnes, started confidently. He presented photographs first, images of me looking exhausted after long workdays. A picture from the manufacturing plant taken during a difficult period when we had layoffs. Another from Lily's birthday party when Daniel had deliberately changed the date without telling me, making it appear as though I had arrived late. Without context, the photos painted a clear story. A distracted mother, a distant parent. Barnes spoke smoothly. "What we see here is a consistent pattern of parental disengagement," he told the court. Rachel dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Marcus nodded solemnly from the gallery. Then came the videos. Carefully edited clips of Lily crying, Owen looking frustrated, Marcus's voice narrating. "This is how the children behave after weekends with their mother." The implication was obvious, that I was the source of their distress. Barnes continued. "Mrs. Morrison has had to place the children in counseling to address the anxiety caused by their mother's unstable living situation. I felt Patricia shift beside me, not nervous, ready." Barnes finished his presentation dramatically, and Rachel took the witness stand. She wore a gray blazer that made her look like the picture of responsibility. Her testimony was smooth, practiced. "Laura became distant," she said softly. "She stopped engaging with the family. I tried to save the marriage, but eventually I had to prioritize the children." Barnes asked the final question. "Do the children feel safe with Mrs. Morrison?" Rachel paused carefully. "I believe they love her," she said, "but love isn't always enough." Marcus nodded from the back row like a proud supporter. Daniel crossed his arms confidently. They thought the performance had worked. Then Patricia stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to the bench and handed the judge a thin folder. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "before we proceed further, we believe the court should review the financial disclosures related to Allied Defense Consulting, LLC." Marcus blinked. Daniel frowned. Rachel looked confused. Judge Mills opened the folder. Her expression hardened almost immediately. She flipped through several pages. Then she looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Webb," she said evenly, "can you explain your involvement in Allied Defense Consulting?" Marcus hesitated. "That's my business. The business that has received approximately $45,000 in transfers from Mrs. Morrison's accounts?" The courtroom went silent. Rachel's head snapped toward him. "45,000, she whispered. Marcus stared at the judge. "It was consulting work." Patricia spoke calmly. "Consulting work without a contract, without a license, without disclosure during divorce proceedings." Judge Mills closed the folder slowly. Then she looked toward the clerk. "Schedule a forensic audit," she said. "I want full financial records from both parties." She turned back to Marcus. "And notify the Financial Crimes Unit." The entire room erupted in whispers. Daniel's confident expression collapsed. Rachel looked pale. Marcus suddenly looked like a man realizing he had stepped into the wrong fight. And Patricia leaned slightly toward me. "Now," she whispered, "they begin to fall apart." But the real turning point hadn't even happened yet, because the next witness about to walk through the courtroom doors was the last person Daniel and Rachel expected to see, Sophia Martinez. And the moment her voice filled that courtroom, their entire story would collapse in front of everyone. When Sophia Martinez walked into the courtroom, Rachel's entire body stiffened. She recognized her immediately. So did Daniel. And the look on their faces told me something important. They had never imagined Sophia would show up here. Sophia walked calmly to the witness stand, wearing a simple navy dress. No dramatic entrance, no performance, just quiet determination. The kind that comes from someone who knows the truth and has already decided they're not afraid of it. She raised her right hand, took the oath, and sat down. Patricia approached the stand slowly. "Miss Martinez," she said gently, "you were employed by the Morrison family for 2 years, correct?" "Yes," Sophia replied. "I was their nanny." "And when did your employment end?" 3 weeks ago." "Why?" Sophia took a breath. "Mrs. Morrison asked me to lie." The words fell into the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Rachel's face flushed red. Marcus shifted in his chair. Daniel stared straight ahead. Patricia continued calmly. "Lie about what?" "She wanted me to sign an affidavit," Sophia said. "A written statement saying that Mrs. Morrison drank alcohol around the children and behaved erratically." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Patricia tilted her head slightly. "And was that statement true?" "No." Sophia's voice was steady now. "Mrs. Morrison never drank around the children. She was always prepared when she saw them. She brought Lily snacks, helped Owen with homework, and always arrived on time." Rachel suddenly stood up. "That's not true." Judge Mills struck the gavel sharply. "Sit down, Mrs. Morrison." Rachel sat, shaking. Patricia continued. Miss Martinez, did you ever witness conversations between Mr. Morrison and Ms. Rachel Webb that concerned you? Yes. What kind of conversations? Sophia glanced toward Rachel for a moment before answering. They talked about Mrs. Morrison like she wasn't a person, like she was just an obstacle. Barnes, Daniel's attorney, stood up quickly. Objection. Hearsay. Patricia turned slightly. Not if the witness has recordings. She handed a small USB drive to the clerk. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Rachel's voice filled the room. Just move the money before she notices. Laura doesn't check the accounts closely. Marcus's voice followed. Even if she does, what's she going to do? Show up in court and cry? Rachel laughed. We just have to make her look unstable. The recording ended. The silence afterward felt almost physical. Rachel stared at the floor. Marcus looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Patricia waited a moment before speaking again. Miss Martinez, is that an accurate recording of a conversation you heard in the Morrison home? Yes. Are there more recordings? 5 more. Judge Mills leaned forward. Miss Martinez, did anyone instruct you to provide false testimony under oath? Sophia looked directly at Rachel. Yes, Your Honor. Rachel's composure finally shattered. You told me it was clean, she shouted suddenly at Marcus. You said the business was legitimate. Marcus stood up. You signed the transfers. You said Laura would never find out. You wanted to do it, Marcus snapped. You were the one complaining about her. Their argument exploded across the courtroom before anyone could stop it. Judge Mills slammed the gavel again. Enough. The sound echoed like a gunshot. You will both sit down immediately. Rachel collapsed back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Marcus sat down slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. Patricia took advantage of the moment. Your Honor, she said calmly, we would also like to submit evidence of a prior complaint filed against Mr. Webb in Indiana involving financial manipulation. Judge Mills read the document quietly. Her expression hardened with every line. Then she looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Webb, you will need legal counsel immediately. Marcus opened his mouth. Your Honor, I am issuing a restraining order effective immediately, she continued. You are not to contact Mrs. Morrison or either Morrison child until further notice. Marcus froze. And I am referring this entire matter to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office for investigation. The room erupted in whispers. Rachel looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. Her sister Beth had already slipped quietly toward the exit. Daniel's lawyer looked pale. For the first time since the hearing began, Daniel turned toward me. His expression wasn't angry, it was stunned. Like he couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. But the final collapse came from the next witness. She had spent 4 weeks evaluating Owen and Lily. 7 sessions total. 2 at my home, 3 at Daniel's, 2 at school. Her report was thick, detailed, clinical. At Mrs. Morrison's residence, she said calmly, the children displayed secure attachment behaviors. Both children appeared comfortable and emotionally open. Judge Mills nodded. And at Mr. Morrison's home, Dr. Brennan turned a page. Both children displayed signs of anxiety. My chest tightened. Owen reported that Mr. Webb grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises. Rachel buried her face in her hands. Lily expressed fear that if she talked too much about what happened at home, her mother might lose custody. The courtroom grew painfully quiet. Judge Mills looked up. In your professional opinion, Doctor, where do the children feel safest? Dr. Brennan didn't hesitate. With their mother. Patricia folded her hands calmly. Judge Mills picked up her pen. The scratching sound filled the room. Finally, she spoke. Primary physical custody is awarded to Laura Morrison, effective immediately. Rachel sobbed quietly. Mrs. Morrison will have supervised visitation every other weekend, pending review. She looked directly at Rachel. You allowed your children to live in an unsafe environment. Rachel nodded weakly. Then the judge looked at me. Mrs. Morrison, your children will be released to you today. For a moment, I couldn't move. Patricia touched my arm gently. You won, she whispered. But standing there, in that courtroom, watching the lies collapse around Daniel and Rachel, It didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth finally catching up with people who believed they were untouchable. And outside the courthouse, the consequences were only beginning. When I stepped outside the courthouse that afternoon, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner. October had begun settling over Cleveland, and the trees lining the street had started turning shades of deep orange and gold. For months, the world had felt gray to me, like everything had been filtered through stress and uncertainty. But standing there on those courthouse steps, breathing in the crisp autumn air, I realized something. The storm was finally over. Marcus Webb had already been escorted out of the building by 2 officers. Judge Mills had made it very clear that he was not to come within 500 feet of me or my children. The criminal investigation meant his problems were far from finished. Rachel stood alone near the bottom of the courthouse stairs. Her sister had disappeared. Her friends were gone. Even Daniel's lawyer had left quickly, eager to distance himself from what had turned into a disaster. Rachel looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally. The confidence she had carried for months was gone. When she saw me walking toward the parking lot, she called out quietly, "Laura, wait." I stopped. For a moment, we simply stood there looking at each other. Her voice shook. "I'm sorry." Not the dramatic apology she might have rehearsed in the past. Just 2 small words. "I destroyed everything," she said. "I know that now." I studied her face for a moment. But this time, they weren't part of a performance. "You did," I said calmly. No anger, just truth. "Marcus, that you were cold, that you cared more about work than your family." She looked down at her hands. I nodded slightly. "You believed him because you wanted to." "Rachel, you're right." For a moment, the only sound between us was traffic moving down the street. Then she asked the question she had been building toward. "Are you going to keep the kids from me?" I shook my head. "No." Her eyes lifted slowly. "They need their mother," I said. "But they need the real version of you, not the version who lied, not the version who chose a manipulative man over her own children. The real one. If you want to rebuild that relationship," I continued, "you'll have to prove they come first." She nodded quickly. "I will." Then she hesitated. "Can I call them tonight?" "Supervised calls," I said gently, "through the court app." Rachel nodded again. "Thank you." I turned and walked to my truck. This time, I didn't look back, because Owen and Lily were waiting for me at Patricia's office, and they were the only 2 people who mattered now. 10 months later, life looked very different. Owen made the honor roll for the first time. Lily stopped waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares. Rachel completed parenting classes and started therapy. Her visits with the kids slowly moved from supervised to more flexible arrangements. She was trying. Actually trying. And for the children's sake, that mattered. At work, the manufacturing plant promoted me to operations director. The raise meant I could finally move out of the old duplex. No more dripping faucet. No more sleeping on the couch. Just a small house with a backyard where the kids could play. Marcus Webb eventually took a plea deal. 20 months in county jail. Full restitution for the money he and Rachel had moved. A permanent restraining order. He would never come near my family again. One Saturday afternoon, Owen and I stood in the backyard throwing a football. Lily was drawing with chalk on the patio, covering the concrete with colorful shapes and crooked hearts. Owen caught the ball and looked at me thoughtfully. "Mom?" "Yeah?" "You knew you'd win, didn't you?" I shook my head. "No." He frowned. "Really?" "Really." I tossed the ball back to him. "I didn't know I'd win. So why did you keep fighting?" I smiled slightly. "Because fighting for you and Lily was never a question." Owen nodded slowly. Then he threw the football back. "I'm glad you did." I caught the ball and looked around the yard, at my children, at the quiet life we were slowly rebuilding. "Me too," I said softly. And if there's one lesson I learned from everything that happened, it's this. When people underestimate you, they reveal far more about their character than yours. Daniel and Rachel believed they could rewrite my story. They believed they could take my children, my reputation, and my future. But the truth has a strange way of surviving. It doesn't always win quickly. Sometimes it takes patience. Sometimes it takes evidence. Sometimes it takes standing quietly while others laugh at you. But eventually, the truth catches up. And when it does, the people who built their lives on lies discover something too late. The strongest person in the room was never the one shouting. It was the one who stayed calm and waited for the truth to speak for itself.